Hey everybody, welcome to week 3 of music history in quarantine. I hope you guys are all doing okay. Hope you're staying safe. Hope that you're not going too stir crazy. I know I've started to get a little crazy myself. So this week we're going to get moving on the second part of Caribbean music. We're going to learn about 3 cultures and their music and a little bit about their history. That's going to be Jamaica, Cuba, and Trinidad are the 3 countries that we're going to focus on today. But first, stupid videos. I will say the second video is not stupid. It's actually amazing. It's a music video, and it features Simon Bolivar, the Simon Bolivar Orchestra, and they're playing a great tune from West Side Story. It's not stupid. It's actually awesome. Anyway, enjoy the first video, though, which is stupid. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed those. We're going to move forward with our first big topic of conversation, and that is the island country of Jamaica, which is famous for having kind of being the home for ska and reggae and some other more modern styles of music that we'll learn about here. Well, first, a little bit about the history of Jamaica. So, Jamaica was an English colony for most of its history, at least after 1655. Before that, it had been a Spanish colony, but not for very long. But Jamaica was English for most of its history, and England was responsible for most of the slaves that found their way to Jamaica. You see, Jamaica, like a lot of other Caribbean countries and islands, is really good at growing sugar. And sugar was a huge export to the rest of the world, and it's also very, very hard to grow. Sugar cane is very difficult and very labor-intensive to grow. So the English brought slaves to do most of the hard work. Those slaves, the descendants of those slaves at least, are mostly the people who are in Jamaica now. So most of the current residents of Jamaica are descended from the slaves that were brought there during the slave trade. There are no native Jamaicans that we know of in terms of the folks who were there before colonization, European colonization existed. Just like we learned about last week, most that's because of disease. So Jamaica was a part of the British Empire until 1962, when England, or really the United Kingdom at that point, started shedding a lot of its former colonies. At the same time that Canada became its own country, same time that India became its own independent country, Jamaica was included in that group of countries as well. In 1962, they broke out of, or they became a free country, free of English rule. And that also kind of began a large diaspora where lots of people started to leave Jamaica and move to other places. There was a large influence of Jamaicans who moved to the United States, an equally large number of people who ended up moving to England, of all places, in order to try to find work. That diaspora, as we've seen previously, the movement of people from one place to another brought with it the culture, the music, and a lot of the sort of important history of Jamaica with those people when they moved to those other places. Jamaica had been a fairly poor country for most of its history, and to a degree that's still true. Tourism is the thing that drives most people and the most of the economy in Jamaica nowadays is people wanting to come there because it's a beautiful place. But tourism isn't always a reliable source of income. So many people after 1962 tried to move out of Jamaica to find better work, a better life for their family. Next, let's learn about Jamaican music. The first style of Jamaican music we're going to get into is ska. Now, maybe you've never heard of ska before, but it's maybe my favorite of these Caribbean musics that we're going to learn about for reasons that I won't get into right now. So ska is based on 1950s American R&B, and that might seem like a weird thing to say. But Jamaica is just close enough to the southern coast of the United States that it could pick up radio broadcasts from the coast. And R&B in the 1950s, as we've learned about with rock music, was really popular. A lot of kids were listening to it on the radio, dancing, that whole thing. And Jamaica was just close enough to be able to pick up these American R&B broadcasts. And ska was apparently what Jamaican musicians thought American R&B sounded like, even though The radio broadcasts for all those hundreds of miles away were kind of crackly and bad. The musicians in Jamaica were trying to replicate what they heard on the radio, what they thought American R&B sounded like, and that's where we actually get ska. So even though there was no direct communication between the musicians, radio influenced Jamaican music to form this kind of thing called ska. Now, ska is dance music, and it's meant to be kind of fun and upbeat, but it also has sort of a protesty edge to it too. It's a thing we're going to see a lot in these Caribbean musics. So in the 1950s, Jamaica was still a colony of England, and by the 1940s and 50s, Jamaicans weren't very happy being a colony of England. It was not necessarily a popular thing, and there was a lot of protest music that was being written, and ska kind of became a part of this sort of protest scene, or at least it kind of became a counterculture to it all. But ska music is meant to be fun for the most part. It's upbeat, lighthearted dance music. So go ahead and play the first video that I've got linked there for you. You're going to listen to one of my favorite Jamaican ska bands, the Skatalites. Enjoy it. All right, I hope you liked that. Now, ska eventually became even more political than it had already been. This is where we get reggae, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with reggae, especially its sort of big figure, Bob Marley. And reggae is based on ska. It has that same sort of upbeat feel that you've heard now. That upbeat kind of feel, which is very, very common in Jamaican music, is present both in ska and in reggae. But reggae is a lot slower and is a lot more political than ska had been. Even though ska had been a little political, reggae was focused almost entirely on political messages. And that influence came from the 1960s American folk music. So Bob Dylan, that kind of stuff. Things that were meant to be counterculturally important, speaking to the marginalized people in the United States, like Bob Dylan's music had done. But reggae music was doing the same sort of thing, making a political message, but this time making it apply for Jamaicans, especially as they were starting to protest being a colony of the UK. So Bob Marley's music spoke a lot to Jamaicans and the situation that they were in, but it also resonated a lot with people throughout the entire world. Obviously, reggae nowadays is like viewed as this really kind of popular countercultural music. And it got, of course, wrapped up in a thing that you're probably vaguely familiar with, which is Rastafarianism, which is its own big religion. If you're interested in the history of what all of that means, I've linked a really interesting documentary at the end of all of this that you can go and watch. And we'll get into the history of reggae and roots movement and all the kind of stuff that came from that political time period in 1960s Jamaica. It's very interesting. It's about an hour long, so you can decide if you want to spend the time doing that or not. It's a lot of interesting information, especially if you like reggae but don't maybe know a whole lot about it. Anyway, go ahead and listen to this song by Bob Marley and the Wailers. Enjoy. All right, next we're going to learn about Jamaican toasting. You may never have heard of this style of music, but this is pretty interesting. So imagine you're at a grand old European, old Europe kind of party. And you walk into a party and maybe some guy sitting over the corner, dressed all up, maybe he's got a big stupid powdered wig, I don't know, announces you and the person you're there with to everybody. Presenting blah, 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 blah. That person who is presenting people is called the Master of Ceremonies. They're sort of in charge of the party, like the wedding planner in a way. They make sure that the party goes off successfully. This traditional style of European parties with their formal announcements and masters of ceremony became common in lots of places that used to be colonies of the UK, especially Jamaica. And Jamaican parties, which were much less formal, decided for whatever reason to keep this role of a master of ceremonies, somebody who announces people as they come into a party. And over time, that announcer sort of morphed into something a little bit different. A master of ceremonies became a person who was responsible for putting on the party. Maybe they were the ones who were funding it. Maybe they were the ones who were throwing it, whatever. But they took on a different kind of role in Jamaican parties. This is probably the best time to go ahead and watch the video that I've got, and then I'll come back and explain what's going on. That might have seemed an awful lot like rap, but those videos were from the very 1980s, very early 1980s. But this style of music, that style of toasting, it's not rap, had really been going on since the early 1970s, maybe even before that. And you might say, well, Smith, that just sounded and looked like rap. It's not. It's Jamaican toasting. And we'll explain how that became an influence on what nowadays we call rap and hip-hop. We'll get there. Not this week, but we will get there. Jamaican toasting centered around an MC, a master of ceremonies. And the MC would be the one who at first would, early on, would make up little rhymes to go along with introductions of people as they came into a party. And eventually those little rhymes, those toasts, like, when you toast, you clink your glasses together. Now we say a toast to this person at a wedding. Clink, usually the bride and the groom. That toast, or that, recognition of people as they come into a party, slowly grew more elaborate and became toasting, or stringing together lots and lots of these sort of rhymes at a party, and almost to the point where it became the party itself. MCs, masters of ceremony, started hiring DJs, people who are really good at playing records. We haven't talked about DJs and record playing and all that yet. We'll get to that when we learn about hip hop. But there was what's kind of called a sound system culture that developed around Jamaica, where these guys who had these big giant speakers and really complicated mics and amplifiers became pretty famous because they had all the sound equipment. And DJs, these guys who had all the stuff, sort of became attached to masters of ceremonies. Like, hey, I'm an MC, I've got this big party coming up, I need a DJ, let's hire this guy. They work together for a long time, and eventually you get this sort of relationship between an MC who's doing toasting and a DJ who's playing music behind the person who is doing this toasting. Now, those of you who know what rap is like, you might say, oh, wait a second, isn't that like what early rap was? Yeah, it was. And this is one of the origins of rap. We'll get to that, though. So hopefully you enjoyed that little video. I know it's kind of hard to understand all their accents and stuff, but it's pretty interesting. I do want to make a quick reference here to dub and reggaeton music, the kind of stuff that you might hear if you like, EDM or kind of more dance kind of music stuff. Those things are distantly related to reggae. Reggaeton is more like way more of a dance style, but it is also Jamaican roughly in origin. So if you like that kind of stuff, just know that Jamaica is where a lot of it came from. Now, just based on those three big styles of music that I've introduced to you, ska, reggae, and now toasting, you might start to see why last week I said that Jamaica was such an important cultural influence on the rest of the world. Those styles of music went on to do a lot of things. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about what those influences were next week. Cuba is the next island that we're going to be learning about. I want you to start by watching the short documentary about the history of Cuba included in the links. So Cuba had been a Spanish colony ever since it was discovered by Columbus in 1492. Sugar, especially sugarcane, grew incredibly well in Cuba. And by the 1800s, Cuba was the largest sugar producer in the world. Again, slaves are the ones who are doing all of the actual work in harvesting the sugar, growing and harvesting the sugar. But unlike Jamaica, the people who live in Cuba are not just descendants of those African slaves. For whatever reason, the Spanish and the African cultures intermingled much more on Cuba than they did in Jamaica. So the folks who are on Cuba now are essentially a blend of African slaves and Spanish colonists. So this changes the dimension, this changes the flavor, as it were, of Cuba quite a bit. It stayed a Spanish colony for a long time, very wealthy, very important Spanish colony, until 1898. And this is when things start getting kind of complicated. Hopefully in your other history classes, you've learned a little bit about the Spanish-American War. But it was a big deal, and it caused a lot of things to change in the world scene. I'll give you the very short version of this. By the late 1800s, America was looking to become more powerful. It had already manifest destinied its way across most of what we now think of as the United States. But it wanted more, and it looked to its closest neighbors in order to get that more, especially the Caribbean. So America started to say, hey, we kind of want that Cuba. And they sent a Navy flotilla down to Cuba just to kind of check it out and see what was going on. Now, of course, behind the scenes, America had started causing some aggression with the Spanish because they saw Spain as being fairly weak and having lots of fancy islands that they wanted, some in the Caribbean, some not in the Caribbean, some in the Pacific. And they said, hey, I think we might want to go to war with these folks. There was a battleship, the Maine was the name of the battleship, that was parked in Havana's harbor. And mysteriously, it exploded. Now, the cause of the Maine's explosion has been kind of a mystery for a long time. Some people think that it was actually done by America itself. Some people thought it really was blown up by the Spanish, or more likely it was due to just an explosion that happened because people didn't know how to store coal very well. But one way or the other, the destruction of the battleship Maine in Havana, Cuba's harbor, became sort of a rallying cry to start the Spanish-American War in 1898. So America started a war against Spain, and it did this on two fronts. It attacked in the Pacific, especially in the Philippines, and then it attacked Cuba. This is where you get Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders and all that kind of stuff. So America entered its first kind of world war, if you will, against another traditional European power in 1898. And they won the war very quickly. And as a result of the war, they paid Spain a little bit of money and got a whole bunch of islands. So for a while, the Philippines were a part of the United States. This is where Guam became the Guam that it is now, a part of America as a territory, where there's a huge naval base. We also received Cuba and Puerto Rico, and a whole bunch of other places too. But those are the four kind of big ones. So in Cuba's, especially in Cuba's history, Cuba was an American protectorate until 1902. That means that they weren't quite a territory, but America could exert their interests to kind of control what was going on. For those of you who are historically interested, this is kind of like what happened in Japan after 1945, after World War II. But America decided after the Spanish-American War to keep Cuba as a protectorate. In 1902, they released them as a protectorate and allowed them to basically become their own independent country. So from that time period, between 1902 and until 1953, Cuba was basically an American playground. You had lots of very, very wealthy Americans who would travel to Cuba to go gamble and drink and party. Of course, that time period is when you had things like Prohibition in the United States going on. So if people wanted to party and drink alcohol, one of the options was go to Cuba. They had Cubans started setting up big nightclubs, big casinos. You had a huge mob influence from the U.S. mob. Cuba basically became like Las Vegas, but in the Caribbean. And this led to all kinds of really interesting things. One of those things is Cuban musicians who were playing in these nightclubs had to start to learn how to play American pop music. This might seem kind of insidious, but for those of you who've maybe ever traveled abroad or gone to a resort, you might notice that a lot of the culture of those resorts that you go to is actually not the native culture of the place, but is instead your culture. Resorts are meant to be places where you go on vacation, where you relax. And a lot of people, when they go to vacation, don't want to necessarily learn about someone else's culture. They just want to have fun. In Cuba, when Cubans were essentially hosting American tourists, they realized that, hey, wait a second, we can make more money from these American tourists if we get them to have more fun. So Cuban nightclubs started playing not Cuban music, but American pop music. And by the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, American pop music was big band swing. This is a really interesting thing where you end up having Cuban musicians who form American-style big band jazz bands, swing bands, to play for American tourists who are there staying in hotels and nightclubs. And you have some huge sort of famous nightclubs that get started, all kind of run by the mob. It becomes this big kind of thing. And things were going okay if you were, wealthy in Cuba at this time period. Cuba actually had decided to become a democracy in the 1950s. And as a democracy, they could choose who was going to lead them, who was going to be doing what. However, there was a growing number of dissidents in Cuba who were unhappy with the relationship between America and Cuba. They realized that, wow, a lot of the money that's coming into Cuba through these nightclubs and casinos and hotels is not staying here. Cubans are not benefiting from American tourism. And one particular person, a guy named Fidel Castro, came to power by saying, hey, what if we Cubans were able to make more money off of these American tourists? What if the money that was being brought in by these tourist places stayed in Cuba instead of going out back to the United States, because a lot of these nightclubs and casinos were being owned by American mobsters? You get this really sort of crazy confluence of things, and it all comes to a big head in 1953 with the Cuban Revolution, when Fidel Castro and lots of his other folks take over Cuba, and Cuba becomes a communist country. And at that point, things get a little bit rough between America and Cuba. This is where it eventually leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis and other things that hopefully you've learned about in your history classes. So that's where we're going to leave this conversation about Cuban history. So let's get into the Cuban style of music called Mambo. Mambo is a really interesting style of music because it's both music and a style of dance. And this style of music and dance is based on 1940s American big band swing music, but with a much more what's called Afro-Cuban flavor. Now, Afro-Cuban style of music is sort of a complicated thing to unpack here. Afro refers to African, and Cuban obviously refers to Cuba. Afro-Cuban music is this kind of special type of music that developed in Cuba and has existed there ever since really colonial times. But Afro-Cuban music combined with American big band music became this new type of thing called Mambo. And in the 1950s and 60s, Mambo became the big style of music in Cuba. And it's a big, loud, cool, exciting dance music. So I've got two videos for you. One is a music video and one is featuring a little bit more of the dance. I want you to watch those two, then we'll come back and talk. I hope you enjoyed those. I know watching and listening to Mambo is really exciting. That Afro-Cuban kind of style of rhythm is really awesome. That clave sound, that you hear in a lot of that Mambo music is so unique and so cool and so interesting. and all of those Afro-Cuban instruments, the timbales and bongos and congas. It's just a lot of fun to listen to, a lot of fun to dance to, too. So the history of Mambo becomes very influential in the United States and American music again. So even though Mambo is based on American big band swing, it eventually finds its way back to the United States. And in the 1950s and 60s, Mambo becomes club music, especially in New York City, specifically in a club called the Palladium, which on this next slide, that's how you spell Palladium. The Palladium was a club in New York City and is kind of where salsa came from. Now, you've probably heard of salsa music before. Salsa music is very, very closely related to Mambo, but Mambo is the much more original Cuban style of this music, while salsa is much more kind of Americanized. They're both really awesome. We'll talk more about the history of Mambo and salsa and how Mambo eventually became hip-hop next class. Let's learn about the music of Trinidad. Trinidadian music is called Calypso, and the history of Calypso and the history of Trinidad really are special and unique in how they influenced each other. So let's learn about this. Trinidad has been a colony of England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. It's been essentially under the control of everybody at some point. Because of that, Trinidad is very sort of culturally different than the other countries in the Caribbean. The folks who are there are mostly descended from the slaves that were brought when Trinidad was a colony of all these different places. But the languages that are spoken in Trinidad are much more wide-ranging. Basically, most people speak English, but there's a lot of other languages there too. Most recently, it was a colony of, again, the UK, and again, in 1962, it was given independence. So just like Jamaica, which was cut loose in 1962, Trinidad was as well. But there's one aspect of this that's very different, and that is that the United States viewed Trinidad as a very important place because it's so close to South America, and it is so far to the east of the Caribbean. The United States Navy viewed it as a potentially important strategic place to put a Navy base, so that it was close to the Atlantic, it was close to South America, and it was close to the United States. It seemed like really a perfect place to build a giant naval base, and in fact, they did. And if you go back through this, maybe you're familiar with Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is actually a giant Navy base in Cuba. Cuba and Guantanamo Bay, which is still actually technically territory of the United States, that has its own long and complicated history. But the U.S. really liked to build naval bases on places. Pearl Harbor is another very famous Navy base that is built on an island, this time in Hawaii. Guam is almost entirely now a Navy base. Again, as a result of all of these Spanish-American War islands, the United States decided, hey, we got islands now, let's put Navy bases on them. Trinidad was not actually taken over by the United States, but they did ask to build a Navy base on it in 1940. And this is an important thing because this actually has a huge influence in the music. You might say, well, how is a Navy base connected to the music of Trinidad? Well, it's all about those steel drums. So steel drums, if you remember from last class's slides, are built out of oil drums, 55-gallon oil drums. And after the United States left the Navy base after World War II, they decided to leave millions and millions of these empty oil cans just sitting around the island of Trinidad. And all of those rusting old oil barrels sitting around inspired especially a guy named Ellie, who there's a documentary that's connected in the links, which you should watch if you're interested in this, to, hey, what if we tried to make instruments out of these things? And at first, they were basically just like trash cans. People just used all these oil barrels as trash cans. But then people were like, hey, maybe we can hit them. We can kind of play music on them. Cool. Well, this guy, Ellie said, hey, wait a minute. What if we were to try to tune them to play specific notes? And he was the first person to pioneer a method and a tuning system as it applied to banging with hammers and thinning out the metal of an old American Navy oil drum into a pitched instrument, an actual drum that can play lots of notes. Now, this is crazy, because without those oil drums sitting around left by the U.S. Navy, the steel drum, a thing that has become so closely associated with Trinidadian music, but also just Caribbean music in general, wouldn't have existed. It's such a strange thing. But these steel drums are amazing. I just love the sound of them. This is an excuse for me to have another video of some steel drum playing, so why don't you watch this? Now, even before steel drums were a part of Trinidadian music, there was a style of music called Calypso. And Calypso music is very, very happy and upbeat and bouncy. And it's just a very joyful music. So Calypso music, again, is meant to be a dance music. It did occasionally have some political use as well, and sometimes was used as kind of light protest music against the British. But mostly it was meant to just be feel-good music. So go watch this Calypso music video by Lord Kirshner. Now, strangely, perhaps the most famous Calypso musician in the world is not actually from Trinidad. Even though Calypso music is from Trinidad, Harry Belafonte, who is probably the most famous singer in Calypso music, is actually from Jamaica. Watch these next two videos about Harry Belafonte. I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson in learning about the history of these islands and the great music that was made there. I've left a whole bunch of links in the extra bit for you to watch if you have some time and if you don't have anything else to do. There's a lot of great music, a lot of interesting information, a lot of interesting history down there. So if you have the time, I would encourage you to go and watch those. There is an exit ticket for you to take based on the things that we've listened to and learned about today. I hope you guys stay safe, and please, 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 wash your hands.